Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritti sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Itam Shri Radhika Prananatha Pada Sarojayo Yena Premanubhutyasha Dattam Tam Shri Gurum Bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Bilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Mudakelato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Nama Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripakrite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhuttanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pango Mama Mandamater Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanastrinam Dantaya Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputrakanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haiturastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Parakamala Shrita Chetasam Me Chittam Satam Madhukari Yatupada Padme Bhaktir Yanikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Prada Vishayajat Sukyat Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Param Bhaja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Vrajaloka Vad Gurutara Prem Naiva Tasyai Namah Yaram Yanikila Ghashanga Shamani Shrotratritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yadhari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Maha Sagar, Shri Gauranga Maha Prabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pāda. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali. So in our last reading, we concluded our extended discussion of the third subject matter in this verse cited by Sri Rupa Pāda in regard to Bhagavad-dharma-tattva, or the essential nature of Bhagavad-dharma, and that was jāti buddhi, or rather the prohibition against jāti buddhi in regard to Vaishnavas. So we concluded our extended analysis of that, and how both twice borndom as well as, a birth in what's considered a noble caste are fit to be respected, and how Vaishnavata is fit to be respected even more so than that, and how wherever anything respectable is found, respect is to be shown to that, in essence, is how all of that boils down. And thus, if one neglects to show respect to the Vaishnavattva within someone and thinks that the prevailing influence of the caste of their birth is a more significant factor in what will determine how one will treat them, then that will be a disrespect to the person as well as to bhakti, and thus unfavorable to one's own practice of Bhagavad-dharma. So we went through all of that. So today we'll go into the remaining attitudes. So just as a recap, this verse is essentially a list of unfavorable attitudes which contain misunderstandings about Bhagavad-dharma or about the nature of Vaishnavattva. So by censuring these various misunderstandings or unfavorable attitudes, then the ideal attitude is alluded to. So we'll continue to summarize those attitudes and what is the proper positive response that's meant to be fostered by those following the path of bhakti. So I don't think we'll finish the verse today, but we'll probably get close or into the last of the subject matters that are therein. So I've got a new file, and I'll start from the top of that. So the next phrase is as follows. Next in the verse under discussion, there is mention of, quote, the notion of water in relation to the sacred foot wash of Viṣṇu or the Vaishnavas. That is, thinking that the water which has washed the feet of Viṣṇu or Vaishnavas is not different from ordinary water. Such water is indicated to be indeed different from ordinary water in the verse under discussion by its being described as, quote, a destroyer of the contamination of Kali mala mathane, which implies that such water purifies one who honors it of all sin and other unfavorabilities to bhakti. Sri Sanatana Pad cites scores and scores of verses from various shastras in praise of the footwater of Sri Bhagavān in the 9th Vilas of Hari Bhakti Vilas, and then indicates that there are many, many more such verses which extol the greatness of Sri Bhagavān's footwater. Quote, even after counting all the waves in the ocean, who can describe the greatness of the footwater of Sri Bhagavān, celebrated in all the shastras? So I haven't, because this commentary is already very long, I didn't go into a list or select a set of statements on this topic. I thought this is fairly well known, and we would better to keep it short. So just to indicate that there's, waves and waves of praises in this respect. So, because this topic is fairly well known, what we'll examine more so are the intricacies of it, or how is it then that when such praises are there, that some may not directly perceive the effects that this water is said to have. So relatedly, Sri Jiva Pad, in his discussion of the subject in Shraddha in Bhakti Sandarbha, takes up the subject of why so many of the greatnesses of Sri Bhagavan's footwater described in the Shastras are seldom tangibly observed in practice. So he says, a person endowed with Shraddha never has a lack of confidence, even in the powers heard about in Shastra, of objects, classes, qualities, and actions related to Bhagavan in connection with practical affairs of the world. In other words, when it says that this water that has washed the feet of the deity can cure all diseases or, rectify all wrongs or things like that, and then one drinks it and then isn't instantaneously cured of one's disease, then a default simplistic response might be, well, then that statement is not true because I have direct experience of the opposite. So he's addressing this subject by saying, therefore, such a person's non-engagement with them, that is, with objects and so forth related to Bhagavan, as a result of sussing out particular defects in them, by means of vision of them being ordinary material objects and so forth, shall never come about. In other words, a person who has Shraddha doesn't doubt that these objects have this power, so they don't assume that they're just ordinary objects, doubt the statement in the Shastra, and then go and look and say, oh look, this is just like anything else, and it also has this fault and that fault in it. They don't venture to approach it in that way. They, meaning these objects, are indeed possessed of such power, as is described in the Brihad Naradiya Puran. Quote, the water from Hari's feet is known to prevent untimely death, destroy all diseases, and cease all suffering. Some, however, even though they have Shraddha in these objects and so forth, are closed off from the effects of these objects, in that those effects do not manifest at present to them, as a result of the fault of their own offenses. So in other words, if someone says, well, I believe what the scripture says, but yet I still haven't seen anyone become magically cured of cancer by drinking such and such, water from this temple. And if it did cure cancer, then why can't we start handing it out to all the millions of people in the world suffering from cancer? And why doesn't it work? There was I remember seeing in the news some time back, there was one kind of like, what do you call that? Sort of like social watchdog sort of person who runs like a society against blind faith. This is in India, and was targeting a particular guru who people were coming to him with cancer, and he was just saying, don't worry about medicine, don't worry about anything, just pray and you'll be fine, or just chant and you'll be fine, or chant this mantra and everything will be fixed. And was just sort of very point blank ordering them like this. And then this person was saying that, the critic was saying that if you're really able to cure cancer with this mantra, like, why don't you go cure everybody with cancer then? And if you know that this might not actually cure cancer, why are you telling these people not to take medicine? And if they have this kind of blind belief in you, this could be socially reckless. And anyway, some subject was going on like this in popular news media. So this would be how, from a Gaudiya Vaishnava theological perspective, that type of sensitivity could be addressed. In other words, in Jiva Goswami's view, the idea is that the foot water that's washed the feet of Bhagavān, in other words, the water remaining after one bathes the shalagram śilā, this does have that power, but the power only becomes manifest to people who are free from aparad. So by asserting that it has the power, you're not at the same time necessarily giving someone a false guarantee that it'll work in their case, or that it'll always necessarily be tangibly observable. And thus, someone can have conviction in the meaning of the Shastra and at the same time not be disturbed if what the Shastra claims can be the effect of the object is, even when they don't see the effect, because they can understand that there's something also inhibiting the effect from coming out, and thus there isn't actually a contradiction to what's being stated. So, in other words, those who have Shraddha in objects and so forth related to Bhagavān understand that as a result of offenses, the power present in the objects that the Shastra says they possess are not seen to manifest to persons who have committed offenses. And thus those who have Shraddha in those objects have no lack of conviction in the statements of the Shastra, or in the existence of such powers in those objects themselves, even when those powers are not seen to practically become manifest. So, this is one practical consideration. A few other relevant statements on this subject. So, the topic is the water that's washed the feet of both Viṣṇu and the Vaishnavas. So, these statements that we've just discussed were all related to water that has washed the feet of Viṣṇu. So we also hear about statements regarding the foot water of Vaishnavas, such as these well-known payars in the Charitamrita. Sri Kaviraj Goswamipad speaks emphatically about the greatness of Vaishnava's foot water in Chaitanya Charitamrita. Quote, the foot dust of bhaktas, the foot water of bhaktas, and the food remnants of bhaktas, these three have great power. By honoring these three, prema for Krishna manifests. All the Shastras again and again proclaim this. Therefore I say again and again, listen, O bhaktas, faithfully honor these three. From these three comes the elation of Krishna's name and prem. So in other words, if you can have faith and honor these things, you'll be blessed with the experience of prema, the joy of prema, the joy of chanting Bhagavan's name with prema, and so forth. Sri Prahlad Maharaj also speaks in praise of the purifying foot dust of Vaishnavas. These well-known statements, quote, inclination towards Krishna cannot arise on account of another, on its own, or on account of both, that is, on its own and on account of another, for those intent upon household life, who have entered darkness because of uncontrolled senses, and whose chewing is only of the chewed therein again and again. In other words, if one is adamantly, intently pursuing some material object, then to feel inclination for a spiritual object is not going to come about. In other words, you're not going to really feel inclination for Krishna if you actively foster and sustain an intentness upon worldly things. So they, meaning those of that staunch worldly interest, of debased mind, who honor only those whose aim is in the external, certainly do not understand Vishnu, he who is the object to be reached only by those whose aim is related to the self. In other words, persons who see material objects as the ultimate thing that could be achieved, who do they respect, who do they honor? People who share that attitude, and therefore they don't understand the attitude of people who are principally intent upon a spiritual object. And they don't understand the value or the nature of that spiritual object. So what happens to such persons? They also become bound by the strong strands of Isha's cord, like the blind being led by the blind, in other words, by the material gunas. Their inclination, the need of which is the cessation of the insubstantial, does not touch the feet of he of great stride, that is Bhagavān, so long as one shall not accept a bath in the foot dust of the divested, the great ones. In other words, unless they get that foot water or the foot dust of the Vaishnava, unless they get a sanskar for bhakti by association with a mahat, then the inclination that they feel for worldly things is not going to go away. It's going to remain and flow on and on perpetually in that way. And even though what would really be good for those people is if their inclination were turned away or were brought away from the insubstantial objects that it's focused on, nevertheless it never does. And because it never does, then they never come in touch with Bhagavān, or that which would ultimately fulfill them more deeply than any of the objects they're intent upon ever could. So their trajectory doesn't change until they get sadhu sangha, or until they get the touch of the feet of the foot dust of Vaishnavas. So thus, the purport of this censure in the verse under discussion of the notion of water in relation to the sacred foot wash of Vishnu or the Vaishnavas is to teach that one should faithfully honor this foot wash, since making a gesture of honor so great as drinking and placing atop one's head the water that has washed another's feet is a sure way to convey deep respect for the other. And when such a gesture is made towards Sri Bhagavān and his bhaktas, then they are sure to graciously reciprocate. So there's the idea that there can be a literal power coming through the physical substance of the dust or the water. And in some cases, there are descriptions in the Shastras or in the lore of various bhakti traditions that do attest to that. But from a psychological perspective, the idea of honoring, bowing at the feet, touching the feet, taking the dust from the feet on the head, or drinking the water that contains the dust from the feet, that this is meant to show, not simply mere subordination, or it's not merely a power play and how to make people subordinate themselves to religious authorities or something like this, but that for someone to electively perform such a gesture is indicative of them making a gesture of profound respect. And it's from respect that you can have trust, and that you can be trusted with teaching, and you can be invested with energy, blessings, and so forth that can lead someone on this path. So honoring, having that type of respect for even the water that has washed the foot of the Vaishnava, then all the more, what about the teachings that come out of the Vaishnava's mouth? What about the acts of love and kindness that the Vaishnava expresses? Then how much respect will there be for those? This is the Kaimutya Nyaya, in other words, that the more one learns to respect, and not simply make a show of respect is not merely a social gesture, but to actually feel respect by virtue of recognizing the value of the thing, which ultimately, implies the necessity of wisdom, that this is what leads to ultimately the experience of profound blessedness and ultimately love for Bhagavān, for bhaktas, for the experience of bhakti. So to, in a formal way, build in an etiquette that contains these gestures is how, our acharyas and how the Bhagavatam itself have designed this path, and no doubt that's a viable strategy, if you will. It's not, with all due respect to it, we can say it's not that there aren't instances or ways that cultural arrangement can't come out of tune or can't function in a way that lacks success in achieving its result, but that the wisdom of the rishis was to, so to speak, build in this system which could gradually work as a framework for people to be benefited, although at various stages or along the way there may be periods in which it may be, so to speak, more in tune with the spirit of its purpose or not. So in any case, the overall topic here, what's being censured in this verse, is to think that there's no blessing or no value in that foot water, or that Vaishnavas and Vishnu are not worthy of being shown profound respect. This is essentially what's being censured. So the underlying teaching is that we should show the greatest respect to deities of Bhagavān as well as his bhaktas. So now we'll move on to the next topic. Next in the verse under discussion, there is mention of the notion of an ordinary word in relation to the name of Śrī Viṣṇu in a mantra. That is, the notion that names of Śrī Bhagavān, like Krishna and Rama, which are found in mantras like the 18-syllable Gopal mantra, and which are, quote, vanquishers of all sin, are just ordinary words like pot and cloth, and not rather of the essential nature of Bhagavān himself. So the commentator is referring to, classical examples from Nyaya Shastra. So to think that words or the names of Bhagavān are no different than just commonplace words, this will be a lack of regard for Bhagavān's name. So explanations given by Sri Sanatana Pad and Sri Jiva Pad of Sri Bhagavān's names, non-difference from Sri Bhagavān himself, were discussed earlier in the commentary on Padyavali 25. We're not going to go into those again because we've gone through them earlier. By understanding them, one can avoid the offenses to the name of assuming the statements in the Shastra regarding the name, such as statements of the name's non-difference from Bhagavān himself, to be mere praise and fabrication, or fabrication. So these offenses to the name were discussed earlier in the commentary on Padyavali 31. So we're not going to go into a not long discussion of Nam-tattva here, although we could if we wanted to elaborate on this verse specifically, but because we've touched on these aspects of Nam-tattva earlier in our discussion of this text, we can just point back to them from here. So that's all that we'll get into on this regard. So we come to the final subject of the verse. Finally, in the verse under discussion, there is mention of, quote, the notion of equality with those other than himself in relation to Viṣṇu, which refers to the mentality of considering devas like Brahma and Shiva to be separate and independent of Viṣṇu, and as such to be equal to Viṣṇu, as is referred to in Vaishnava Tantra. Quote, one who shall see Narayana Deva only as being equal to Brahma, Rudra, and other devatas shall surely become a heretic, or pashandi. So now, this last topic of the verse we're going to give some attention to. It's not something that we've gone into much or so far in the commentary on the text. And it's something, especially for those who live in the Indian social context, is very important to understand. And also, although it's maybe not perhaps as immediately culturally relevant or significant in terms of how to understand one's own family tradition or the local traditions of one's region, for foreigners or persons who weren't raised in a Hindu social context, to understand how there are all these different devatas and how one can view them all and show respect to them all, and yet at the same time, especially for those with, Abrahamic traditional influences who are accustomed to a monotheistic concept and a supremacy of the concept of monotheism, how all of this is to be regarded, and whether it can be brushed off as some sort of mere inferior polytheism, or whether there is a monotheism inside that, or whether even the term monotheism isn't really applicable, or what have you. All these sort of concerns we will get into, and these are also topics that our acharyas have specifically commented on and which are directly relevant to what they call Paramountcy thought, or an approach to worship and bhakti that is focused specifically on objects of spiritual nature or of ultimate absolute reality, and also how to understand so many statements in the various Puranas, in the Gita, and the Bhagavad, that can appear to present contradictory viewpoints towards these subjects. So for the sake of addressing all those concerns, we'll offer some discussion. Sorry, some chord here looks like it's not doing very well. Not sure what the problem is. Oh well. Might need a new chord. Sorry about that. Okay. So let's dive into it. Viṣṇu is distinguished from all beings in the universe other than himself by the mention in the verse under discussion of him being, quote, the Ishvara of all Ishvaras, or Sarveshvaresha. In the reading of the verse under discussion commented on by the commentator, so there are variants in the Padyavali, in the critical edition, which is what I'm using as my base for this discussion, you have the name Viṣṇu, but sometimes the commentator's readings of the text differ from the critical edition's readings, and in the critical edition's reading, in the commentator's reading, he has Krishna instead of Viṣṇu. So if we consider that the name Krishna is there instead of Viṣṇu, and we consider how that could be interpreted in light of Rupa Goswami's theology, then, in the case of this reading, the name Sarveshvareshvare sarveshvareshe, could also be interpreted as the Ishvara of all Ishvaras, since the theological view of the compiler, in the theological view of the compiler, Sri Krishna is Swayam Bhagavan, the supreme form of Bhagavan, who is the Ishvara even of all other Ishvaras, that is, self-manifestations of Sri Bhagavan like Rama, Nrsimha, oh my gosh, there's a typo, Narayan, and so forth. So, if you say Vishnu, and depending how you, in Rupa Goswami's theology, how you take the position of Vishnu there, in other words, are you referring to, say, Garbhodakashayi Vishnu, then in that case, you might be more inclined to interpret the word Ishvara inside the compound Sarveshvara in a lowercase sense, as referring to devatas like Brahma or Indra and so on. But if you take them in the capital I sense, then that would be applicable in the case of speaking of Swayam Bhagavan, who's considered the Ishvara even of other manifestations of Ishvara. In other words, as, Karanadakashayi Vishnu is considered the Ishvara even of Garbhodakashayi Vishnu, and Vaikuntha is considered the Ishvara even of the Mahavishnu, Karanakashayi Vishnu, and so on. Ultimately, Krishna is seen as the Ishvara of all Ishvaras in the theological view of Rupa and Jiva and so on. So you could capitalize it or not capitalize it, depending how you want to contextualize it. And if you like capitals on your absolute figures in the first place, which is also, merely an English language convention. Anyway, Sri Jivapad discusses the subject of the singularity of pure bhakti's object, or upasya ananyata. That is, Sri Bhagavan alone being the object of worship on the path of Uttama Bhakti throughout his sandarbhas. So this is an important point in laying out the path of Uttama Bhakti, that who will be the object of bhakti, and is that bhakti one-pointed or focused on him and no other. That's essential for bhakti to classify as Uttama Bhakti. In other words, you might have bhakti to, this devata or that devata, or, classically speaking, they speak of bhakti to the husband or things like this. So if we talk about Uttama Bhakti, then the idea is that both the object of the bhakti as well as the nature of the bhakti to that object are both uttam, or of the purest or highest or greatest excellence. So for bhakti to be uttama, it has to have upasya ananyata, or it has to have a oneness in its object. It can't be a little over here and a little over there. It has to be purely flowing towards its object. So this subject, we'll look at the way some places that Jiva Goswami has treated it. So in doing so, Sri Jivapad repeatedly cites the following statements, that should be of Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself on this topic. So this is in the Gita 9:23-25. Even those bhaktas of other devatas, endowed with shraddha in those devatas, who perform worship of those devatas, also worship me alone, albeit improperly. So Krishna is saying, yes, people worship other devatas, but they're actually worshipping me. But if you consider that they're worshipping me, then that's not really the best way to worship me. It's an improper way. Why? Since I am the enjoyer and master, that is, the bestower of the results of all the yajnas they perform for other devatas. In other words, they're performing worship thinking that the result of that worship is being granted to them by that devata, but it's actually me who's ultimately receiving the worship and supplying the result through the agent of that devata. They, however, do not properly understand me in truth and thus fall down. In other words, they don't have an understanding of this supreme devata that's beyond the realm of samsara, and therefore they don't transcend samsara as a result of performing worship. Even though when you do worship a transcendental devata, you also contain a transcendental end. So thus he says, those whose rites are for the devas attain the devas. Those whose rites are for the ancestors attain the ancestors. Those, whose sacrifices are for the spirits attain the spirits, and worshippers of me verily attain me. So what you focus on, that's what you attain. We've already discussed what they call tat kratu nyaya. So if you worship me, you come to me. If I'm beyond the realm of samsara, if I'm of a transcendental nature, then you'll also come to me as such. You'll also become such. And if you don't, then you won't. Therefore, he says, that they fall down or they continue to revolve in samsara. So Sri Jiva specifies in his discussion of these verses that the worship of devas other than Sri Bhagavan spoken of in these verses is called, quote, independent worship, or swatantra upasana. That is, worship based on the notion of a devata, that is the recipient of the worship, being an entity existent and capable of sheltering and reciprocating with a worshipper independently of Sri Bhagavan. So, as, a preview here, what we're going to get into is that what matters more than who you're worshipping when or where is why, and how you conceive of the nature of that object. So when he's speaking about the centering of worshipping devatas other than the supreme devata, or speaking of reaching other destinations based on that, what's really at play is the understanding that one has of the object that one is adoring. So, if one conceives of the object of worship as independent, in other words, that, being an entity existent and capable of sheltering and reciprocating with a worshipper independently of Sri Bhagavan. So you could say that this alludes to what you might call a polytheistic worldview. In other words, the idea that there isn't an ultimate singular reality that's the source and the basis of all else, or of all duality, and then, tripartite, and then, all the infinite variety that can come about, to see the world such that it boils down to a plurality of entities which exist independently of each other, and thus are independent in the sense that they don't depend on another for their own existence or for their own capability. That type of attitude is what he is calling here, quote, independent worship. Sri Goswami contrasts this, quote, worship of another, that is independent worship, with exclusive worship, or ananya upasana of Sri Bhagavan, that is worship which has no other object than Bhagavan, and thus is free from, quote, anya upasana, or worship of another, by citing a later statement of Bhagavan Sri Krishna also in Sri Gita. So Krishna goes on to say, but by exclusive or ananya bhakti, O Arjuna, I in this form am able in reality to be known, to be seen, and to be entered, meaning fully united with one who is a performer of action related to me, for whom I am supreme, who is my bhakta, who is free from attachment, and who is without enmity towards all beings, attains me, O son of Pandu. Excuse me. So Jiva Goswami then comments specifically on this phrase, Mot Parama, one for whom I am supreme, means one for whom I alone am supreme on account of my being both the means and my being the object to be attained. Thus, this bhakta is free from attachment to other means and objects, that is free from attachment to anything other than me as his means and object. So, to the bhakti taught in the Bhagavatam, the quote, Ananya Bhakti, or Nishkinchana Bhakti, or Uttama Bhakti, etc., means that the bhakti has one singular object. So for the bhakti to have one singular object, the bhakta has to hold that object as ultimate. So the bhakti has to be here what Krishna calls mat parama, or one for whom I am supreme. And if one doesn't have that view and sees that one object of bhakti is suitable, another object is also suitable, and doesn't have a clear sense of the relation between those objects, or conceives them to be, independently existent, then that will not be a type of bhakti that fits the characteristic of being, quote, ananya bhakti, or uttama bhakti. So, Sri Jiva in this way specifies that for bhakti to qualify as the abhidheya, that is, as that which is the principal directive of the Shastra, it must have Sri Bhagavan alone as its principal object, and not any other being, be it a devata, human being, or otherwise. By means of both anvaya and vyatirek, that is, statements of both affirmation and negation, he stresses repeatedly over the course of his Bhagavat Sandarbha the importance of taking shelter solely in Bhagavan and rendering worship solely to Bhagavan. In particular, he cites a statement of Akrura to Bhagavan, Sri Krishna, as an affirmation. This is a verse which we discussed at length in the sections on Sharanagati. So what Pandit would fully approach a shelter other than you? To whom bhaktas are dhīr, whose words are truthful, who are well-wishing, who are grateful, and who bestow all thoroughly desired objects upon a well-wishing worshipper of yourself, and even your own self upon them, without any accumulation for or diminution of yourself thereby. In other words, what greater shelter, what greater object of bhakti could there be than Krishna, than Bhagavan? And then, as an example of vyatirek, or affirming or asserting this point by negation, he cites the following verse from the 6th canto, quote, an ignorant person who approaches anyone other than Bhagavan, he who is never without a gentle smile, always of completely fulfilled desire, solely by virtue of his own acquirement, equanimous and completely peaceful, is no different than someone who wants to make an utterly futile attempt to cross the ocean with only the support of a dog's tail. Sri Jiva also recapitulates the underlying reason for this singularity of the object of worship. That is the reason why Sri Bhagavan is the ultimate manifestation of the one non-dual Paratattva, the absolute all-integrating entity of which everything is a pervaded part and upon which everything is dependent, by citing various statements from Srimad Bhagavatam and other texts. So this one comes from Satyavrata in the 8th canto. The Supreme Purusha, even a trace of a 1/10,000th part of whose grace other devas, gurus, and persons, be they parents, kings, and so forth, combined, are independently of him unable to grant. I take shelter of him, you, the Supreme Ishvara. And another, which is very well known, and as we discussed also earlier in the Sanatana Shiksha discussion, as the trunk, branches, and sub-branches of a tree are all satiated by watering the tree's root, and as the senses of the body are satiated by offerings of food to the stomach, so all beings are honored by worshipping Achyuta. In regard to the second verse, Sri Jiva cites the commentary of Sri Sridhar Swamipad to explain its primary import. Quote, even the results, the causes of which are the propitiation of various devatas by means of various rites, also occur just by propitiation of Hari, whereas nothing occurs by means of worship of those devatas alone. The point made here is that one achieves nothing of eternal spiritual value as a result of worshipping devatas as independent as entities independent of Sri Bhagavān. So if someone does get some benefit from the worship they offer to some devata, then that was actually only enabled by Bhagavān, who provided it to that person through that devata, respecting the shraddha that they have. But one could have gotten that very same object by just worshipping Bhagavān himself instead of that other devata. So there's nothing to gain by worshipping anyone other than Bhagavān. And on top of that, if one thinks that someone who one is worshipping is not dependent on Bhagavān, then there's no way to attain anything of eternal or spiritual value. So, in the absolute sense, when I say spiritual here. So, Sri Jiva Pad further states in this regard that there is no necessity of performing separate worship of devatas or others, even just for the sake of satisfying them. So someone might come along and say, okay, but I just worship Shiva because, or this devata or that devata, any devata, I'm not singling out Shiva, because that's our family tradition, and we love to do puja, and we have a temple, and we just want to please Shiva because of all the great things that he does. We're not worried about the results that we get from him. So someone might say, so therefore we'll carry on with our puja as we are in that way. We're not concerned with results anyway. So addressing that, Jiva Goswami says that there's no necessity for performing separate worship of devatas or others, even just for the sake of satisfying them. Because of such a separate endeavor to do so is redundant, since worship of the devatas and all other beings is accomplished of its own accord just by performing worship of Bhagavān, as is evidenced in a verse from the Skanda Puran. Quote, when Isha, the Deva of Devas, the wielder of the conch, discus, and club, so Bhagavān Hari, shall be worshipped, then all the devatas shall be worshipped, since Hari is omnipresent. So the idea is, all the devatas you want, if you say, well, we just want to satisfy them, we're not trying to get anything from them. Okay, but if you just went and worship Bhagavān, all the devatas would be satisfied with that. So it's not that you need to go and try to go and satisfy them directly. Just go and do what's the very best thing you could possibly be doing, and that itself is satisfying to them. So he goes on. Sri Jiva Pad also cites statements that condemn perception of devatas as being existent independent of Bhagavān, such as the aforecited verse from Vaishnava Tantra, stating that seeing Narayan to be equal to other devatas makes one a heretic or pashandi, and the following verse from the same text. Quote, dull seers of equality with Viṣṇu, that is, those who see devatas to be equal to Viṣṇu in capability rather than dependent upon Viṣṇu for capability, cannot attain one-pointed bhakti to Hari, even if they are of one-pointed mind. So in other words, someone might be of very pure mind, might be of great discipline, concentration, meditation, willpower, etc., but if they don't have the theological understanding of who that one-pointedness is best directed to, then even though they have that capacity to be one-pointed, they won't ultimately have one-pointed bhakti to Bhagavān. So, Sri Sanatana Gosvami also cites these verses from Vaishnava Tantra in Hari Bhakti Vilas and comments on them as follows. Sri Brahma and Sri Rudra are guna avatars. Indra and others are manifest magnificences or vibhutis of Narayan. Bhagavan Sri Narayan is the source of avatars, or the avatari, and vibhutis, means he's where these vibhutis and these guna avatars come from. He's the supreme Ishvara. So that's in quotes. So in other words, if someone thinks Brahma and Shiva are guna avatars, Indra and others are vibhutis, and all these avatars and all these vibhutis, they all come from Narayan. He's the avatari. This understanding is propounded by the Shastras. In other words, that's what the Shastra is ultimately teaching, is the theological hierarchy. Therefore, heresy or pashandita arises because of disregard for Shastra as a result of equal vision of him with others. So if one sees other devatas to be equal to he who is the source from which they descend, then that amounts to contradiction to the Shastra, or disregard for the Shastra and its import. So thus, someone who sees that way is labeled here a heretic, or a pashandi. Thus it was stated by Mahadev in the Brihat Sahasranama Stotra, quote, Diksha is not to be given to a non-Vaishnava, to one whose mind is affected by doubt, to one devoid of conviction in bhakti, or to a seer of equality on the part of others with Vishnu. In other words, Diksha should not be given to someone who doesn't have the attitude necessary to practice it properly, or to cultivate the object that it's meant to lead one to. It is also stated at the end of this stotra by Sri Durga Devi, quote, Alas, Vishnu, the Ishvara of all, the greatest of all the devatas, the original guru of the universe, is seen by fools as though an equal to others. So here we get to now some more subtlety. Sri Jiva also explains that Sri Brahma and Sri Shiva should be seen as Vaishnavas, and thus to see them as the opposite of that, as independently existent and independently worshipable devatas, does not lead to the attainment of bhakti to Bhagavān. Moreover, such vision actually leads to the transgression of heresy, that is, contravention of the conclusions of the Shastra. In this regard, however, one may wonder what then is the purpose of the numerous statements that can be found in the Shastra that do enjoin vision of devatas, such as Shiva, as being equal to Vishnu. So you can find so many stories or so many accounts that make it sound as though Vishnu and Shiva, or Vishnu and other devatas, are equal, or even that Shiva is superior to Vishnu. So Sri Jiva explains that such statements are meant for a certain class of upasakas. So this is the hermeneutic twist here. In other words, yes, the Shastra can be seen to say that, so he's saying that ultimately various types of statements are applicable to the mentality, or those who have a particular attitude and pursuit. So he says classes of upasakas, such as bhaktas possessed of shantarati and jnanis. Though he also states elsewhere that bhaktas following the path of one-pointed bhakti see Shiva, as well as other worshipable persons, such as the Guru, as non-different from Bhagavān, specifically by virtue of great dearness to Bhagavān. So he's acknowledging that the Shastra does in some place say that there's an equality between these devatas. But he's saying, from what perspective and for what purpose did the Shastra speak that way? They speak that way for the sake of jnanis, or for the sake of persons with shantarati, in which seeing that type of equality is conducive to the spiritual object that they pursue. And for bhaktas, however, that type of vision of equality is not conducive, or seeing that type of equality won't lead to attainment of one's goal. So, in the case of bhaktas, if we want to interpret statements that say that Vishnu and Shiva are non-different, then we can take it not in an ontological sense of equality, but rather an equality on the basis of the fact that they're very dear to one another. So he says, quote, Thus, it is not equality or non-difference in general, but specifically the notion of equality or non-difference in the sense of supposed independent capability that is determined to be a misunderstanding. An understanding of equality or non-difference between Shiva and Bhagavān based on Shiva's dependence upon Bhagavān and the great dearness of Shiva to Bhagavān is rather laudable. So, to boil it all down, basically the point is being made that it's not simply that you see them to be equal or not equal, but how and why you see them that way. And there is admissible and valuable ways of seeing them to be equal, And there are also inadmissible ways, or ways of seeing that won't be conducive to progress on the path of bhakti, or that will be applicable more to the perspective of a jnani. So for those who aspire to follow the path of bhakti, then these attitudes are being shaped, or the whole point of this discussion, this verse that we're talking about, why is this attitude censured? Because not having a sense of the greatness of the object of one's bhakti will lead to a lack or a slack in one's bhakti to that object. So there should be a great sense of, in one sense, pride or, conviction in the ultimacy and in the beauty or in the merit and the greatness of the object of one's bhakti, for that bhakti to be something that really is deeply felt as well as strongly practiced. So all of these attitudes are there, broadly speaking, to foster that. So I think that's as far as we'll go today. And we'll look at some more of the intricacies of how the relationships between the different devatas, or notions of ontological hierarchy, play out in regard to various statements in our next discussion. And perhaps in that discussion we'll conclude our discussion of this verse finally after many days. So I'll stop here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or anything else, then please feel free to share. All right, well, we can leave it at that for today, and we'll dive further into this topic in the next class. Vaiṣṇavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai Radhe. Thank you, Baba.